Greetings, I'm Roberto Valdez, Master of the Science of Geography and instructor at Northern New Mexico College in Española, New Mexico. Rivers of ice have formed and sculpted the landscape in many places in the world, the subarctic and the Arctic, places like Canada and Alaska. But believe it or not, the American Southwest, El Norte Mexicano, has evidence of a time that it was much colder, an ice age, that has left landscapes that were clearly sculpted by the action of snow and ice. In this presentation we will be covering that, but first of all, you will recall that geography is the science concerned with the description, the distribution, and the interaction of the physical and the biological features of the Earth and human activity on it. You will see in this presentation the difference between the alpine and the continental glaciers. You will see the anatomy of a glacier and the process of how they behave. You will become with glaciated landscapes and landforms. You will become familiar with permafrost, and you will understand how global warming caused glacial retreat. Climate change has been occurring for quite a long time. First of all, let's cover the continental glaciers. An ice sheet is a continuous mass of ice covering vast areas. An ice cap is circular and covers a landscape in a smaller area, but no peaks are poking up. Then you have an ice field, and this is found in vast areas of very high mountains throughout the world. It's elongated along a mountain range, and peaks and bedrock are visible. Many of these glaciers will calve, that is, they will break apart and float off in pieces into the sea as icebergs. Alpine glaciers look like this as an aerial view. They are rivers of ice that gouge out and scrape as they go the landscape and join each other, such as in this case in tributaries in Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic. Alpine glaciers are defined as those rivers of ice, glaciers, that come from mountains. And they're different than those coming from continents. Glacier formation comes from the accumulation of snow. Snowflakes fall, they build up, and finally those that were first and at the bottom begin to feel the weight of those above, and they get compacted until they form ice. That's basically what a glacier is. It's ice that is accumulated over the continual falling of snow without enough melting going on. And of course, in mountainous areas, well, and of course in northern Arctic areas as well, the ice can't just simply build up and go nowhere. Its sheer weight will cause it to flow downhill. Here's an elementary view of the behavior of a glacier. You have a snowfield where the accumulation happens. You'll have it flow by the sheer weight downhill. You'll have evaporation, also known as ablation, going on. And finally melting at its terminus, with chunks breaking off and calving into icebergs. Now, calving we normally associated with cattle having calves, babies. But in this case, this is the same word applied to the action of the formation of icebergs. Once again, we have the visibility of this illustration here associated with this glacier here. You can see that it doesn't reach the sea, it's instead calving into a lake, which then becomes a river. This is the lower end of a glacier, and you'll notice that it gets darker and darker and darker as it meets its end. It's actively gouging and abrading the sides of the valley and creating this thing they call moraine, gravels and sands and so forth, that it takes along, and as the melting is occurring and disappearing, you see more and more of the gravels and boulders that it's bringing along. So we call the disappearance of a glacier an ablation. Here's a detail of it. You can see that this moraine or this gravel becomes part of the landscape lower down. You can also see a lot of the moraines built up on the sides. We'll go into the detail further on about this. So a lot of the world's fresh water is actually locked up in the form of glaciers at the poles, the Arctic and the Antarctic. At the left is the continent of Antarctica, and on the right its comparison with the 48 contiguous United States of America. it is 1.5 times the size of the contiguous United States. So about 20% of all fresh water is in glaciers, and 91% of that is in Antarctica. You have a mass balance, accumulation versus ablation. So accumulation causes the growth of glaciers, and ablation is the loss, the disappearance of a glacier through melting. So you have at its upper end an accumulation zone where you have gain, and then the direction of flow is of course going to be downhill. Then you have a negative balance and an ablation zone where you see loss. Overall mass balance can be in equilibrium, in balance. But then you can have in some cases a cold period where positive net balance or accumulation occurs. The glacier keeps growing and growing and growing and not melting fast enough. Then you can also have a warm period in which ablation starts to dominate. The glacier is melting, and accumulation cannot keep up with the degree of ablation of the glacier. In other words, the glacier starts to recede back up the mountain. Glacial movement can be due to pressure and gravity. At the top, because of the irregularities of the bedrock below, the top will break into cracks called crevasses also known as. The top is brittle and cracked, the middle is rather plastic and fast, and the base is rubbing against the bedrock. Sometimes it's lubricated by the action of melted water down below, but you can see that this glacier has a behavior of an irregular landscape. Refreezing and melting, and a plastic zone occurs, and you can see the movement of the glacier downhill. Let's show you in an illustration better. The process that I will illustrate here is called plucking. Plucking is basically the action of ice grabbing chunks of bedrock that are fractured and moving them. You can see it illustrated here. The glacier, by its sheer weight, is invading the cracks and sometimes has occasion to lift out a chunk and carry it down. Now, of course, it's doing this on a massive scale. You can see in this inset here the terminus of the glacier dumping all of the material that it has plucked because of ablation at its foot. This is called moraine. Let's look at the formation of alpine glaciers. You have accumulation. It just builds up, doesn't melt fast enough. And so the ice front starts to advance down the valleys. There's not enough ablation going on. So it takes down the snow and ice that is formed above it. Now at its edge, you can see it leaves behind a lot of wastage. A lot of the ice front has left behind what they call moraine. We'll get into detail about that pretty quick. In this animation, I'm going to show you some illustrations instead of the products of a glacier. Loess, which is basically fine soil. Outwash, a vast area of sediment with intricate braiding of streams. Erratics, such as boulders. And till, which are gravels and smaller rocks and pebbles and sand. We're going to move this glacier so that you can see abrasion. Abrasion is the action of rock on rock causing quarrying and plucking. Here's the action of a glacier that ends up in the ocean. You can see that there is the movement of the glacier downhill. Let's show you some further details. So this is the accumulation zone. Snow is falling, forming ice, going downhill. At this ablation zone, this is where we see melting, lots of crevasing, and we also see the sublimation and calving. Calving are chunks, icebergs, breaking off and floating off. In these photographs you can see crevasses or crevasses, quite evident. They are dangerous. Sometimes snowfall will cover them over and hide them, and then hikers go across these glaciers and then fall down into these deep cracks. They're quite dangerous, but if you have partners roped together by a long rope, you can mitigate this danger. When one falls in, this other guy can pull him out. They're formed by forces in tension, compaction, and friction in the glacier, opening up the brittle top layer. The gravels, the line of gravels that you have been seeing, are called moraine. They're rocky debris. They're deposited at the foot of glaciers. They are transported, and much of it is dragged along, and further plucking and quarrying is occurring as the glacier moves along. Glaciers are rather abrasive, so they're carving out the landscape and abrading it and eroding it. Here we see a set of lateral moraines. Now, moraine is basically where the glacier is rubbing up against the side of slopes and plucking out bits of the bedrock and then taking it down as gravel. And then as it meets others and tributaries, they accumulate and get wider and wider as you see as you go down the valley here. Here is a cross-section of an alpine glacier, this time not animated, so that you can see its component parts. First of all, you have at the very top in the mountains an accumulation zone in a rounded basin that eventually is carved out by the glacier and hollowed out, rounded, called a cirque. The snow further goes down the mountainside, and plucking occurs on the bottom of the glacier as well as on the sides, creating what they call medial moraine. And here the plucking is bringing abraded materials and smoothing the landscape as it goes. Now, irregularities still exist, and these open up crevasses. Further down the slope, you can see melting and evaporation at the ablation zone, leaving behind terminal moraines, outwash plain with little streams, and a valley train. And a lot of this material that's left behind by the glacier is also called till. Till is basically the accumulation of gravels and pebbles and so forth. And lateral moraine, like I said, it's basically the glacier is rubbing up the side of the mountain, scraping off material, meets a tributary with another glacier, and then forms a medial moraine. Let's go to this one. Alpine glaciers, they will have several behaviors. One is that when you have a glacier receding back into the mountains because of a warming climate, it leaves a lot of moraine called recessional moraine. Some of it that has been pushed down and layered in terraces is called push moraine. And that we see evidenced here at Wheeler Peak, Nevada. All of this recessional and push moraine forms these irregular terraces of graveled accumulations on the way up to the top of the mountain. Here we see a glacier beginning to ablate here, in which it's evaporating and melting away, and it leaves what they call an outwash at the foot of the glacier. Here's what alpine erosion looks like on an aerial view. You can see the glaciers are flowing. I'll point out in which direction they're flowing, and you can tell right here it's flowing in this direction, this one. And it carries so much moraine with it, it's even becoming discolored. This one is probably flowing in this direction here. Let's look at the landforms. You can see them here that a lot of the peaks are turning very sharp, and you can see a lot of rounded little basins. They have names. We'll give them names. Col, a small rounded basin, or that constitutes a pass in larger, higher mountains. You have what they call a sawtooth. You have a peak. They are called horns. Then you have rounded basins called cirques, and you have large or long, sharp ridges running down the mountain. These are called arêtes. Then you have the main glacier, which is very tall, and joined by smaller glaciers to keep accumulating in size. It's taking along medial moraine. The bottom of the glacier, if you could cut a slice out and see its profile, you would see it's carrying a lot of erratics and moraines at the bottom. Melt away the glacier because of changing climate, and you are left with this kind of landscape that is rather aggressive looking. Again, we have sharp peaks called horns, sharp ridges called arêtes, basins in the upper areas called cols, which are passes. You have cirques, which are large round basins with little lakes, little chains of lakes in this terracing pattern called paternoster lakes. And then you have, because of the disappearance of the glacier, hanging valleys. So streams running through them jump off the cliff and down into the lower valley, carved out in a U shape by the larger glacier. So hanging valleys have this peculiar U shape, as does the main valley where the glacier once existed. And then an individual or solitary lake in a basin, in a cirque, is called a tarn. Tarn. So you have tarns, cirques, horns, arêtes, hanging valleys, paternoster lakes, and U-shaped valleys. Here's a cirque, close up and in real life. You can see it's rounded and stadium-like. They are rounded alpine basins due to the accumulation of snow that has carved them out in a rounded shape. This is the accumulation zone, the birth of the glacier. You can also see a hanging valley in this photograph here with a waterfall. And you can see the sharp ridges of the mountains here called arêtes. Let's look at paternosters and cirques. In this paternoster, or I should say in this cirque right here, you have a tarn, which is a lake, because the glacier, when it forms, has carved out a basin-like shape to it and left behind all of its gravels when the climate changed and the glacier disappeared. Now it still snows in the mountains, and there are still accumulations of water in the gravels and sands of the lower part of the valley, which result in springs and accumulations of water forming these lakes called tarns. On the left, you'll see the example of paternoster lakes, and that's basically a series of lakes in a chain. They're named after the arrangement of beads on a rosary called paternoster. You'll recognize our Father, pater, father, and noster, our. The U-shaped valleys are quite evidence of a glacier. You can see how they shape the upper alpine landscapes of even mountains that we have here in New Mexico and in the state of Colorado, in the southern Rocky Mountains. It creates what they call a great glacial trough, a U-shaped valley, and it comes from the abrasion of the glacier with all its moraine. On the right, you can see another example of an arête. Yosemite Valley in California is a post-glacial U-shaped valley, evidence that a glacier, a large one, passed through here, has left a lot of bedrock very smooth. You can see this large one over here, this large formation, and you can see a hanging valley over here to the right with its waterfall. This is the Yosemite Valley. Glacial landforms will include names like moraine. You have lateral moraine, which are gravels that are scraped off the side of the valleys by a glacier. You have tributaries forming medial remains, and then when they dump everything at the end, where the terminus of the glacier is, you'll have recessional moraine, ground moraine, and terminal moraine. And then this flat plain of gravelly, bouldery accumulation of alluvium is called outwash. You can see evidence that this glacier was once much larger. You can see a accumulation of moraine here, just left behind as a ridge, and a terminal moraine right here. It looks like the mine dump of gravels, but these are made naturally. Let's go to periglacial environments. They are basically landscapes near permanent ice or seasonal snow and snow-free environments in mountains. Among the things that they have are low temperatures, which cause the freezing of moisture in the soil, causing what they call permafrost. It can be quite deep too. You can see here in this profile example a large deep lake and a 45-meter deep permafrost accumulation. This is an example given of places like Coppermine, Nunavut, Hotchkiss in the northern part of Canada, and Resolute. These are illustrated here. So you can see the further south you go from the pole, the smaller the permafrost. It becomes discontinuous and smaller. Permafrost is basically ground permanently frozen. So the Arctic and the subarctic regions have permafrost. Among the periglacial landscapes are this pattern ground. You can see it's caused by the seasonal freezing and thawing cycles that cause on the edges where there are fractures, pushing and pulling and pushing and pulling and tugging, and accumulations of pebbles, broken fragments of rock at these cracks, at these fractures. Here's another view of the same thing, patterned ground, creating these polygons all over the place. There are various formations of them. One that's quite beautiful is here in this mountain valley, another one closer up. These ones are elongated, and this one is much closer in size, or smaller in size. Continental glaciers cover entire continents. We have Greenland, which is a very, very large island being covered very deeply in a glacier that on a massive scale is moving itself to the ocean through several areas. Then you have Antarctica, which is also a huge continental glacier. It's 90% covered up in glaciers. Let's go back in time, a time when we had a different climate in the North American continent, in the world. It was much colder, and we had what they call Pleistocene. The period of time is called Pleistocene. We had large continental glaciers. We can see here the Pleistocene was a geologic time period that began 1.65 million years ago. Then there were about 18 expansions of the ice over Europe and North America, and then they shrunk back, and then they expanded again and shrunk back, and each one obliterating and confusing the evidence of the one that came before. But the experts have figured out that it was 18 times. Glaciation can take up to 90,000 years. Snowfall, finally piling up to form ice that finally gets heavy enough to start moving its way downhill. By contrast, deglaciation, or the melting of glaciers, can take less than 10,000 years to occur. Before I move on to this, let me show you something interesting. At one time, Asia and North America were connected to each other through a land that is hypothetical called Beringia. People migrated back and forth to what we now call Alaska from Asia, back and forth as if it was just one land, and it was for the longest time. And then there's these two major ice sheets, one forming over the Rocky Mountains, another one forming over the large plain called the Laurentide ice sheet. There was a crack between them, or a gap between them, that melted, and once the melting occurred enough, animals and the people who hunted them followed into North America and made their way even to South America. In this view, you can see that Baja California was connected to the main, it wasn't a peninsula, it was connected to the main continent. California was further extended out into the Pacific Ocean. The eastern coast of North America, such as Florida, was a lot longer, and the Gulf of Mexico was a lot smaller. This is what they call the glacial maximum. Let's move through this quickly to this illustration. The Pleistocene ice ages varied throughout time. You can see here how the continents look like presently and how they looked like at the LGM, last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago. And in this formation you can see that Asia was connected to North America. You can see also that the sea levels were all lower worldwide. And as a consequence, certain places that are not connected today, that have a lot of gulfs, were at one time one part. Like, let's look at this. The Arabian Peninsula was connected with Asia and Africa quite clearly. You had Indonesia, which is today an archipelago, was connected. It was just merely a peninsula of Asia. You can see Australia was connected with New Guinea. In fact, they postulate that many Africans, a certain tribe of Africans, came out of Africa and went along the coast to India, to Indonesia, and then in boats went across to Australia and became the Australian Aborigines. They have characteristics that very much resemble certain people of Africa. Continental glaciers are immense in weight, and they can warp and bend the crust. It causes mantle movement. So when the tremendous weight of the continental glaciers sink the lithosphere and distort the mantle, the melting causes the crust to go through this rebound movement by tens to hundreds of meters once the weight has disappeared. And such isostatic rebound can be evidenced here in the northern part of North America, around Hudson Bay in today's Canada. This is where warping of the crust occurred because of the great weight of a former continental glacier 6,000 years ago, before present time. Actually, the rebound is what occurred 6,000 years ago. Piedmont, from the word pie, meaning foot, and mont, meaning mountain, foot of the mountain. These type of glaciers originate in mountain ranges, and they extend as sheets across plains, and then they form a delta at a bay, spreading out in this peculiar fashion. We have a feature here called a sheep rock. In French, it's Roche Montagnier, or an asymmetrical hill of exposed bedrock, abraded and polished by the action of glaciers and all of the moraine that they were carrying. It's called the Lambert Dome in Yosemite, California. And below you can see an example of the glacial polish. Now, don't be deceived by the hexagon pattern. That's fracturing in the rock because of the nature of the rock that is already there. It's likely a volcanic rock, which tends to form these hexagonal vertical patterns, but it's become abraded and polished by all of that sand and boulders and other things that scratched it around and finally polished it. This is what's happening. Glacial plucking is occurring. The movement of the ice polishes this thing. So at one time this was deep under glacial ice, and it was polished. You can see the vertical polishing lines here. Continental glaciers do a lot of deposition of gravels called till. And here we have illustrated here, it's a very small word here, till, right along here. Long ridges called a recessional moraine. You have lots of irregularities in the ground which leave behind these formations. Here's a recessional moraine, an example here, a depression that filled with water, a lake, a kettle lake, a mound here, which is like these, called cames. And basically you have a deranged landscape because of glacial retreat. Here's an example of a deranged drainage with lots and lots of little kettle lakes, irregularities in the landscape caused by the action of a glacier. Clearly you can see a pattern this way, diagonally. Kettle lakes are formed when you have a continental glacier, such as shown in the upper illustration, and then you have the middle illustration, the disappearance of the glacier, the ablation of it. It melted away and left all of these irregularities, these pits. Sometimes a large chunk of ice is left behind, such as here illustrated in C, which melts and forms a little pit that fills in with the water that has melted. So kettle lakes are basically pitted outwash of a glacier. Here's a deranged landscape of a till plain. It's very irregular. There are mounds, there's dips up and down, boulders strewn all over the place, and some places filled in by water. You can see a stream running through here. Glacial activity formed these Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are very important. You have Chicago, an industrial center where railroads converged and where they brought cattle from the Great Plains in the west, where corn from Iowa goes to, where wheat from Kansas goes to. It's accumulated in these warehouses and in these factories and processed and then loaded on barges. There's coal from the west also shipped to Chicago. Chicago is well positioned in an area where you can ship lots of natural resources and man-made agricultural products to, and then send them out in barges on the lakes, and through canals they can make their way to larger cities where there is markets for these products. So lakes were formed by a range of methods: rifting, uplifting, volcanoes, fluvial, that is the action of rivers, alien is the action of wind. But then you have the majority of modern lakes were formed by glaciers, and that's the action of the ice moving and receding and moving forward and receding during 4 periods of the Pleistocene period. You have erosion and deposition of alpine and continental glaciers that form various kind of lakes. You can have cirques, like we saw in the mountain alpine areas, paternosters, fjords. Those are in the edges of the ocean. Basically, they're long troughs of glaciers that intrude into the landscape They are very common in Norway, and that's where the word comes from. Piedmonts, that's the glacier that we saw earlier forming a delta, and then they melt away and then they leave this peculiar landscape such as a bay. Now you have moraine deposition, you have lateral and terminal dams that form, and kettle lakes. The example that we saw here with the Great Lakes were made by a continental-sized glacier that had scouring action and left behind these very large basins in the landscape that filled with water later. The Holocene is our era. It started about 11,700 years ago and is still going to this day. This is a period of warming. 11 degrees of increase Fahrenheit happened that melted away a lot of the glaciers that were on our landscape, including here in New Mexico. Deglaciation created many paleolakes in greater New Mexico, and I'm going to include the broader southwest del Norte Mexicano in this discussion. You had, in our historical records, more currently and closer to our time, AD 800 to 1200, there was a medieval warming period. And so climate got better. Places like Iceland, the southern tip of it, could support wheat growing. And then a little ice age arrived again. And so things got cold, starting at approximately AD 1200 to the year 1900. Now some will say it's more like 1850. Either way, when you look at portraits from Europe of the time between 1200 and 1900, or 1850 I should say, you will see people bundled up, dressed in clothing, layers of clothing, and more well dressed and properly dressed and covered up. That's because the climate in general was colder in those days. Since that time we've been warming up again. We have paleolakes scattered throughout the U.S. West, and I have here the political entities of different states overlaid upon the landscape that was created when you had lots of glaciers in the north that altered weather patterns further south. So the glaciers were at their furthest extent, let's say 12 to 30,000 years ago. And so there was a prolonged wet period south of there, and that was because weather systems would encounter these continental glaciers further in the north, and there was a lot of rainstorming going on here in what is now a dry and arid southwest El Norte Mexicano. So as a consequence, these lakes, which occupy what is now vast desert interior lands of playas, were once large lakes, such as, we'll name them, Lake Bonneville, which has since shrunk back into a smaller lake called the Great Salt Lake. Lake La Hontan, Mono Lake, Lake Cahuilla in today's Southern California. There was a large lake in Central Valley of California, numerous other lakes all in here, and as well in today's southern Arizona. Lake Cochise is an interesting one. Lake Otero is in the Tularosa Valley or Tularosa Basin. It had no outlet to the sea. There was another one in Lake San Agustin, and another one called Lake Estancia. Now all of these are hypothetical. Well, they really did exist, but they are named posthumously, shall we say. They no longer exist. Lake Bonneville has shrunk back and has left behind large, vast areas of flat, salty pan and other areas of desert. But they showed themselves that they once existed. So now let's go to this one right here, in particular, Lake San Agustin in western central New Mexico. Also notice the boot heel here. There was a lot of lakes there as well. I forgot to point those out. Here you see behind this graduate student doing studies on ancient Folsom and archaic man present in this basin. The evidence of a large former lake bed. You can see the alkali flat amongst the prairie grass out there. So this paleo lake existed in west central state of New Mexico. It is now today called the Llano de San Agustin, or the Plains of San Agustin. In the central part of New Mexico, we saw it earlier in the map here, Lake Otero has shrunk back considerably to a tiny little, comparatively tiny little, lake called the Playa Lucero. It There's rainstorms that come off of these mountains, which are primarily made of limestone and gypsum, and they bring down the minerals down to the lake, to the bottom of the basin, and they accumulate seasonally as a lake. Now, it's still, during heavy rainstorms, the lake still can form, Lake Lucero, but for the most part, it is a playa. While the lake had water in it, crystals of gypsum grew called selenite, and that's what you're looking at, selenite crystals on the bottom of this playa. They broke into little tiny pieces, winds came along and blew the sand across, and that is the creation of the Great Sand Dunes, the Great White Sand Dunes Desert. The White Sand Dunes are a very famous sand dune field in south central New Mexico. The other ancient lake, a paleo lake that existed, was called Lake Estancia. It has shrunk back quite considerably to a long mudflat called Laguna del Perro. But some of these lakes are very close and touching upon salt domes underneath the ground. And as a consequence, some of them bring forth layers of salt. You can see here the accumulation of salt in this one called La Salina right here. In historic times, the Pueblo Indians and the Spanish would collaborate with their military, and they would have an armed guard to go in caravan and seeking protection from the Apaches, and travel 90 miles to this salt lake, this Salina, La Salina, to load up on salt, and they would take it back to their villages and towns and use it for a variety of uses. We, for one, need it. We ourselves have a lot of salt water in our bodies, and we need the salt to keep alive and to function properly, both our muscles and our minds. We salt meat to preserve it from getting rotten and other things like this. That's what the salt was used for in ancient times. I should say historic times. The area that I just showed you was Estancia Valley right in here in the state of New Mexico. Other evidence of glaciated landscapes include the Sierra Sangre de Cristo, also known as the Sierra Nevada. You can go to the south of New Mexico and see the Tularosa Valley. There's some glaciation or evidence of large accumulations of snow at one time on Sierra Blanca. You can also see here the plains of San Agustin, or the Llano de San Agustin. Evidence of a former glaciated landscape that created heavy downpours that created inland lakes. There's another one down here in the Boot Hill of New Mexico in the Valle de las Animas, the Animas Valley. Evidence of a glaciation that occurred nearby is seen in the nearby Sierra de las Truchas, near the Española Valley, east of it. This chain of mountains that you are looking at is a glaciated landscape. That's Let's bring another photograph in. We'll show you a variation of what the Sierra Sangre de Cristo looks like. Notice this bowl-like basin. Notice these very sharp edges, these peaks that are very sharp and pointed. These are evidence of arete, which are long, sharp ridges, cirques, which are large bowl-like basins, and horns, which are peaks that have sharp points to them. So you don't have to go far to see that our mountains were at one time dominated by the action of glaciers that formed them into these sharp peak-like shapes. In this presentation, you have seen how ice shapes the landscapes and makes land forms. You've seen the difference between the alpine glaciers, which are in the mountains, and continental glaciers, which are large glaciers at a time of when the climate was different, that covered large areas of land of continents. You have learned that the anatomy, parts of the glaciers and anatomy and the processes of how they behave. Basically, they pluck, they are heavy, they have accumulation zones, and they have ablation zones where they disappear. They pluck up rock, they take it down. The accumulations of these pluckings are called moraine. Then they deposit them at the end, called glacial moraine. They form these long, flat areas called till, and the streams that pour out of these melting glaciers are called outwash. You have become familiar with the glacier landforms as a consequence, including things such as in mountains arêtes, which are sharp ridges, horns, which are pointed peaks, cirques, which are bowl-like basins, hanging valleys, and you've also seen other formations such as paternoster lakes, which are chains of little lakes in terraces in the upper country, and tarns, which are lakes that form in cirques. You have also learned about permafrost, which are areas which in the north, in the subarctic and the Arctic, are areas that have permanently frozen ground underneath. You have also seen how global warming caused glacial retreat. And we don't have glaciers today, but we have glaciated landscapes in New Mexico and in Colorado. And these are evidence of a former time that was frozen, the Ice Age, that ended about 11,700 years ago.